Hello, welcome everybody. I want to first welcome everyone to this discussion that is hosted by DAFilms on the occasion of the screening of 5 films by Shelly Silver. The 5 films will be available on this website, and they are A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch from 2019, Touch from 2013, 5 Lessons and 9 Questions About Chinatown from 2009, Suicide from 2003, and 37 Stories About Leaving Home from 1996. And I'll be joined in my discussion with Shelly Silver, Stefanie Schulte Strathaus, and I should mention my name is Soyoung Yoon. To begin with, my name is again Soyoung Yoon. I'm an assistant professor of art history and visual studies at the New School in New York City. And I'll be joined in this conversation by Shelly Silver. Shelly Silver is a New York-based artist working with still and moving images. She has exhibited widely throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia, including at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Tate Modern, Centre Georges Pompidou, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the Yokohama Museum, the London ICA, and the London, Singapore, New York, Moscow, and Berlin film festivals. He's also the recipient of numerous fellowships and grants. And Silver is also the professor and director of moving image in the visual arts program at the School of the Arts at Columbia University in New York City. And she'll be joined by Stefanie Schulte Strathaus, who is the artistic director of the Arsenal Institute of Film and Video Art in Berlin, as well as the co-founder of the Berlinale Section Forum Expanded. And on that note, if I could ask the two to join me.
Hi, Soyoung. Hi, Stefanie.
Hi, both of you.
So I thought we could begin by talking a little bit about an early film that is not a part of like the films that are curated by DAFilms, and this is called Former East, Former West from 1994. I wanted to start with this because this is in part I think speaks to a persistent interest on your part, Shelly, but also beginning in a sense of a working relationship, a long working relationship that you've had with Stefanie. So I wonder if we could begin there, maybe perhaps starting with a short clip from Former East, Former West, so everyone's on the same page. And then I might ask both you, Shelly, and Stefanie to speak a little bit about the context of both making the film and seeing the film and how you started working with each other.
Ja, zu demokratisch. Wir kommen aufs gleiche Thema, nicht? Indem man jeden, ich will nicht sagen abschrauben, das ist vielleicht zu hart ausgedrückt, aber jeden Menschen reinlässt, ist meines Erachtens nur die Angst gewesen, dass wir den Krieg verloren haben. Ja, schlimm, dass wir angefangen haben. Nur aus Angst, dass wir nun wieder als narzisstischer Staat sehen sollen oder Polizeistaat, wie es im Osten war, heißt es, alles kommt her.
Ich würde Demokratie immer so formulieren, welche Demokratie meinst du, deine oder meine? Es gibt meines Erachtens viele Formen von Demokratie, genauso wie Freiheit. Freiheit, die ich meine. Welche meinst du, sprich deine oder meine? Darum handelt es sich.
Okay, so that was a short clip, like from Former East, Former West. For those of you who are not familiar about the film, I'll just mention that it was shot in Berlin 2 years after the reunification. And it's a film that tries to mark that moment of the unification, but also the changes and that take place in those 2 years, but also the changes that don't take place, and particularly regarding the question of what is shared, what is not shared, especially regarding the German language. Like, so perhaps with that note, I'll turn to Shelly and Stefanie to speak a little bit about and around the film and the beginning of your working relationship.
Do you want to start off, Stefanie? I mean, first, I just want to say how thankful and excited and privileged I feel to be in discussion with both of you. So thank you so much. Maybe just to add a little bit about Former East, Former West, I was invited, or I applied to the DAAD to go to Berlin. And it was at a very precise moment, and I really wanted to find out what was going on in Berlin because the changes were happening so rapidly, and all we had heard from in the United States was there was this euphoria and everybody's free and together and getting along, and when I got there, it didn't seem to be the case. So I took a camera out to start doing interviews on the street, following the words that maybe former East and West Berliners had in common, and then expanding out to the words that were common at the moment, like democracy, freedom, socialism, capitalism, etc.
Yeah, this was really a year. I guess it was also the year when we first met during your DAD residency, Shelly. Well, first of all, also from my side, thank you for this event and screening Shelly's films. But yes, this was in '94, already 5 years after the wall came down. But it was still in a time where I wouldn't say, like you just said, Shelly, free, yes. No, you said free and together. Everything was free and together. And I would say free, yes, together, no. So it felt like a big freedom that we had at that time. When we speak about the city was open. There were lots of empty spaces, a lot of options that we all had to, you could just open a bar, a club, a cinema, whatever. It was kind of the city belonged to us. But I think we were so overwhelmed with this new open city that we really forgot to talk to each other. And I think that only started much later. I mean, this is all my memory, of course. Other people might have other memories. But when I look at your film, Shelly, I think maybe my memory is not, I'm not so alone with that memory, that people West and East did not yet really meet. They were just trying to kind of either cope with the situation or make the best of it in whatever way. We spoke the same language, yes. But other than that, we had a completely different history. And so Shelly made a film from a perspective of someone who came to that city, asking the same kind of questions to people from East and West. And I think at that moment, this was very new and very important. This is probably how we first met, when the film was screened at the Arsenal. And I think it made all of us think a lot.
Yeah, I would say that I started filming in '92. And from, still in New York City, there were articles about the champagne being drunk together on the wall. But when I got there, yeah, there was an incredible amount of, I don't know the word, I mean, there's no one word, distrust, anger, prejudice, there's like a whole bouquet of words. And it was a situation that I didn't really understand. And so this is one of the ways throughout my work that I try to enter a situation and try to understand, is with a camera, and in this case, very simple questions, linguistically driven simple questions. Because also at the time, there was an enormous amount of media driven mostly by West Berliners speaking about East Berliners, or either from the point of view of distrust or kind of victim, and that nobody seemed to be going, to the streets where everything was happening in either case and asking people what they thought about what was happening.
Shelly, it was really striking to rewatch this film in preparation for our discussion today, because I was really struck by its contemporaneity, and it reminded me of, on one level, just how the fall of the wall became a moment for, at least for my generation, but also someone watching the event from Korea, like the way that was a bit, in a sense, the beginning of history, of a new kind of like history with a capital H. And what happens when you take it down to like the level of the streets, what's happening on the ground, and just to talk about this question of distrust, anger, prejudice, like the language that is not shared, like that starts clustering around, getting attached to these simple questions. In a way, the way that the wall might have come down, but the language continues to somehow bear and attract like the history of that division. And the film, for those of you who are not aware, the film begins by asking like what the word home or Heimat like means, and people start talking not just about definitions, but how they start perceiving like those definitions. And I couldn't help thinking that what would happen today in the United States, where we are now experiencing such a degree of polarization, so that people are describing it as two countries in one place that happen to occupy the same space. What would happen like to find that imprint of that division in as simple a device as this kind of vocabulary? So I was struck again about your attention, like as a outside observer, to notice like in this particular kind of nuances of these simple words, like how history keeps on resonating.
But I think that language and the city also really came together in a very particular way, because everything changed. The city changed like overnight and then very fast. And this included the change of street names, and but in the East, not in the West. So yes, it was one city, but at that time, it really still looked like two different cities, very much like two different cities, of course. That took much longer. But what happened really fast was, the erasure of a certain part of history. And so I think there was this speed of change of the city on the one hand, or actually of the two cities, and very quick ideas of how this one city should become, two cities should become one city. But yet we would have needed time, really. And I think this is something that strikes me very much in Shelly's films and all her later films as well. And I think we will talk about that throughout this hour, that most of her films, or all of her films, probably are about watching and waiting in a way, and taking time. And this was really missing in this moment, and Shelly took the time.
Yeah, this was my first time living in a foreign country, and also my first time making a film in a foreign language, which is something that I've continued to do for better or for worse. But this was 100 hours of interviews in German, in analog, on videotape, and the insanity of doing the project. But also, as an outsider coming in, I felt very privileged. I mean, I don't know who else could have made, I was constantly asked where I was from, if I was from the East or the West, or, and that I was from the United States made me kind of outside of the situation, which worked really well. On the other hand, working in a foreign language so extensively, there's something really alienating about it, because when I show it to a German audience, and especially to an audience of like people born in Berlin, where there's certain words, certain dialects, I will never understand it as well as they do.
Just to talk a little bit more about this, and maybe we can move on to another work. But if you bear with me, I was thinking, watching your film again, Shelly, it reminded me of a novel by the British author China Miéville, The City and the City. Do you know this?
No.
Yes, and it's in a sense it's a police procedural plus science fiction, like that tells a tale of two cities where two separate peoples with separate laws, norms, and customs actually live in the exact same place. Like, so they cohabitate, like they coexist, but they cannot acknowledge each other. Like, so there's no border like a wall, but the border is a rule to what they call unseeing. Like, so you are trained like to unsee each other. And sometimes if you slip and acknowledge, say, the glance of a woman from this other world, like, then it's considered a breach, a transgression, and you are then you meet the might of the law. And thought it was interesting that from your position of this outside observer, what it means to take up something that Stefanie just mentioned, this waiting and watching, like, and both in that in between place, like, to perhaps like see that which we have by habit, like, continue to unsee.
And of course, some of it had to do with this weird kind of prejudice for any number of reasons. But some of it was that, you know, if you were from the East, chances are you lost your job. You didn't know how to navigate the bureaucracy. Your housing was insecure. Your relationship to capitalism or to democracy. This was very widely manipulated, I think. So you come across these boundaries of language, of people, but also, and I think it's still somewhat in operation, these boundaries of bureaucracy, this boundary of, you know, the outside powers. That said, waiting, you know, I kept on shooting, and I worked very closely with Annette Mechtel, who amazing, at that time, assistant editor, and helped me do the interviews. And finally, because the situation kept on changing, she said, if you shoot one more frame, I quit. And that's when I stopped filming. It's like, okay. Because, you know, you just want, it's like a, you know, because it just keeps changing. Mm-hmm. Also, the reception of the film when it was first shown was quite, especially in Berlin, quite difficult. And I think in part, I mean, maybe Stefanie knows more about this than I do, but it felt like people were so close to the situation and so fed up with the situation that they didn't want to see it. And then 5 years later, it was sort of like, yeah, but that was the situation. Now it's completely different. And even now when I show it, they say, oh, this is really kind of still, these issues are still on the table. I don't know, Stefanie, what do you think?
I wouldn't say, I mean, I must confess that I don't really, it's many, many years ago, I don't really remember the exact situation, but I don't think people were fed up with it. On the contrary, as I said earlier, you were maybe too early with the film because people were not there yet. They were not yet in a dialogue situation. And like, I mean, today I live in the West, I have friends in the East, and we talk about this a lot. Why didn't we know each other in the early 90s? We could have met, but we met much later. At that time, we didn't, as I said earlier, we were just experimenting with the open spaces that we all of a sudden had, and this new era that was so overwhelming. And we were not yet really, I think, at a point where we were discussing those issues, at least not on a level like your film did, like you did it with your film. And then, of course, it was also a very kind of tense situation. We heard this person in the very beginning talking about that, the rising racism at that time. That, of course, was a big issue. But yeah, I think you were probably just a little bit ahead of the time with this film. Maybe that was, if there was a problem, and I don't remember that people had a problem with the film, but if there was one, then I think it was more like that.
And perhaps on that note, and it is, I think we can keep on coming back to this question about both being being outside and inside, but being too early, too late. And in that sense, I mean, as I was in my own experience, like having not just seeing the extreme contemporaneity of the film, not necessarily about what's going on in Germany. Like, also we can think about how that the processes of unification and what was not resolved, like how it has come back in contemporary politics. But we can think about that in the context of, Shelly, where you and I are in the United States, like, and how that bears, that these divisions like keep on coming back again and again and again. But perhaps on this note, I was thinking maybe you were talking to stick to this question about outside, inside. I thought we could now talk about 37 Stories About Leaving Home, which has a somewhat similar format of the interview, the stories, like, and the stories that people tell, like, and So let's start with a short clip and then come back to 37 stories about leaving home.
そう小さい時に本当にいつも見てた夢っていうのがあって、私の家族がこう並んで立ってて、それで真正面から飛行機が飛んでくる。それで飛行機からミサイルがもうすごい撃ってくるのね。それで私だけ弾には当たらないで家族がみんな殺されちゃう夢っていうのがなんかいつも見てて、家族と離れたくないっていう気持ちと、家族から早く抜けたいっていう気持ちがすごいこうちっちゃい時からあったので、それがきっと出たのかなって。
So that's 37 stories about a clip from 37 stories about leaving home, which is part of the curated series, like through DAFilms, film from 1996. Just very, very briefly, it's a film that deals with that where we see a group of Japanese women talking about their lives, and they cross 3 generations from age 15 to 82, and in the context of this storytelling about their lives, like through the intimacy, through the small like detail or the small point, like we see again the mark of history, especially the history of the war. So with that, maybe I can turn to Shelly, and ask you to speak a little bit more about the context of making that film and yes.
So after my amazing time in Berlin, living as an artist, I was asked by the National Endowment for the Arts if I wanted to apply for residency in Japan, and I had no particular relationship to Japan, but I thought that it would be great to have another year where I didn't have to go back to work as a video editor in New York. Mm-hmm. So I applied with this project about, because at that time, all you ever heard about in Japan was the great economy, salarymen, and it was very, very male, what you heard. And I was interested to hear, to speak to women. And also at that time, I was thinking a lot about my mother and if I was going to become a mother as a daughter. And so I was interested from that point of view also. Like Former East, Former West, it was very interview-based, but it had very few, I think, altogether 14 or 15 people were interviewed. Wasn't done on the street. The interviews were really, I knew nothing really about Japanese culture. And so I asked very general questions, but that would elicit memories, like what is the first memory of your mother, of your house? And I wrote the questions actually, and I sent it to the women and they wrote back. And then after that, I did the interview. It was a completely different kind of interview and feeling to this film. And also very much about storytelling. Mm-hmm. I was very aware that I wanted them to contextualize their own lives, sort of, which is what they do. There's one woman, the 82-year-old woman, who I asked her the first question. She talked for 20 minutes, and then that was it. I asked her another question. She's like, my back hurts, I want tea. And it was amazing. It was amazing the things she said. Yeah. Your question as an outsider, yes, I was very aware of being an outsider. And I think that they were very aware that I was an outsider too, and prepared the answers with that in mind, or so they told me. Yeah.
Mm. Stefanie? Yes.
No, I just thought it's very interesting to compare these in that sense that like you interviewed techniques or your, let's say, your questions. I mean, all of both of the films go back to a title that you already, of a video that you already made in the 80s, Meet the People. So that's basically what you do with your films always. But in this case, whereas in Former East, Former West, you were really asking about people's opinions and trying to let them present themselves by talking about what they think about the state, the situation, the nation, Heimat. Whereas in the other film, in 37 Stories, you would really ask very personal questions, even though you said they were like very, kind of not random, but like big questions, and then you let them talk, but they were touching very personal issues like dreams or memories. And then people would choose how to present them in their private context. So I would be interested in hearing, like, how much would you say, like, in 37 Stories, would you say that they are, even though the questions were so different and so much more personal, that they were also, or in what way were they still also talking about the place where they lived and politics and their contexts and histories?
I mean, in the dream that we just heard from Emmy, it's really interesting. I mean, filming in Tokyo at this moment, I mean, the 20th century saw huge changes in Tokyo. So the older women had been through the earthquake and the subsequent fire, and also the subsequent lynching that happened to Korean people in Tokyo. They had been through the war. They had been through the firebombing because, Tokyo wasn't visited with an atomic bomb, but they had the most people die in one night, 100,000 with American firebombing there. And they also saw a huge change. I mean, I was thinking a lot about my grandmother, my mother, and I, and how much things changed for women in the 20th century in the United States. I think that in Japan, or the women that I interviewed, it was even greater, the changes. And these really came out in the personal stories, as did a lot of more familiar stories, to me anyway, that either the mother should be working to be a good role model, or if the mother is working, they're not being a good enough mother. So this kind of never being, doing the right thing, which I was quite familiar from, especially my mother's generation.
I think particularly in my case, I was of the clips you chose, Shelley, I was particularly struck by this clip with Emin, like where we have this dream of her desire to separate, like, but also, so it's all dreams are ambivalent. So the desire to separate, the desire to attach, and how they're intertwined, and yet it takes on the form of a warplane, like, and I think it was both. On one level, thinking it's watching these films in this order, like from Former East, Former West to now, just the degree which, if the first question was about Heimat, like, and here we now move from the streets, like, to the intimacy of the home, mothers and daughters and granddaughters, but like particularly the mother tongue, like, and so the way that the question of home belonging that was articulated in this very uneasy public space in the earlier film, now in the intimacy of the home also is very, very fraught. So the way that the war keeps on, or history, like, in a sense, has its grip, like, on our fantasies, on our imaginations. Like, I think for me, I just, partly because I was also 96, 97 is when I started college, and I went to school in Korea. And I think in my case, just the way that where we were, that our knowledge of Japan in a way was in a sense constantly held in stasis with the Second World War. I grew up with my grandparents who still spoke Japanese, who still bore the marks of the colonization, of the occupation on their bodies and their habits, and that was directly, in a sense, transferred to the next generation and the generation afterwards. So Shelly, you were talking about generational passages, what has changed, but I think I was particularly struck by what had not changed, what was repeating, what was being held in stasis.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about. Also from my own point of view, I don't know. I don't have so much. I'm always looking. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that, but I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right.
No, it's such a beautiful film, and the way that the intimacy of the storytelling as women share their dreams and desires, that it gets marked, the way that gender makes an appearance, but so as a way to navigate what it might mean to leave the home, to leave, and yet to constantly dream of trying to leave the home also seems to mark how strong the home holds on, and home in this case also meaning nation. So, yes.
Yeah, it was very moving. A few years ago, I was in Tokyo filming A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch, and I reached out to a lot of the women or girls that were in the film that now are women, to sort of talk to them and see where they were at and to ask them questions and research for that film. And it was so interesting to see them that much later and how things played out. And I think that I mentioned that, not necessarily the women in the film, but a lot of the women I talked to were quite a bit angrier than they were in '94 when I was doing the filming. And that I found also very interesting, maybe that there had been a change that they had anticipated, but that hadn't happened, or that certain people were hoping that their children or the next generation would further the changes, but felt that they were going back, why aren't they continuing? And instead, to go for a more comfortable life belonging in society, really. Yeah.
I think this would be a great moment to actually watch a clip from A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch, and then come back to it, but not to constantly bring it back. But it's for Tiffany, in our context in the United States, Shelly and I just this week just woke up to the possible demise of Roe versus Wade and the backturning of abortion rights. So the constant refrain is that we are fighting the same war. The sense of that we've made only so many steps and then being returned back exactly to where we were again, this constant sense of repetition. And in that sense, the anger is something that I can definitely, not just simply that there is a battle to be fought, but that it has to be refought over and over and over again. And that in a sense, we seem to be losing ground. So maybe on that note to shift to David, could we watch A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch? And then we can talk there.
"私はその唇の動きを見る。心が揺れ動く。なんだろう。彼女が欲しい。私たちの周りに異星人がいる。体に突起物がいくつかあり、異星人自身は頭部と呼ぶ。脳が9つ、 甘美な口が一つそこに入る。いかがわしくて小さい彼ら。興奮すると甘ったるいきしむ音を立てる。彼らが命を守ってくれる。でも私たちは彼らを滅亡させる。なぜって？その力があるから。
Maybe I should set it up briefly. So this is shot mostly in a maybe 4-block radius in this part of Tokyo called Tatekawa. And the person who you heard narrating is a Japanese translator who lives in this neighborhood. And an American woman hires her to translate. The American woman is doing research about the declining Japanese birth rate and the situation of women in Japan. And so she hires this, the narrator, and they sort of start this kind of, the Japanese woman is a little bit like arm's length about the American women for very good reasons. And then finally it's a love story. But the Japanese women keeps on interrupting with these kind of science fiction stories that are become bleaker and bleaker, that thread through the film and the neighborhood.
What I really love about this particular scene is that it begins with her saying, "I watch her lips move and I start to drift." So this is again the watching and waiting, or observing, giving things time. And but then from a perspective of the translator, who actually translates you. So you kind of, make this twist. First, everything had to be translated for you, but now it's translated. And now it's translated to Japanese. So it's the other way around. So anyway, I think this is an amazing perspective twist here, and of course the fact that it then turns into a love story and shows this, how should I say this? The position that you're always in, which is a very fragile position actually, and it's very much about looking at something and being looked back at, like another thing that we often see in your films, that people look, or eyes look back at you.
Yeah, I think that fragile, I was in Tokyo in this neighborhood, trying again to understand the neighborhood. At first, when I got there, the last time I had lived in Tokyo, I lived in Yanaka, which is up on the hill, which escaped bombing, escaped the fire. And so a very traditional looking neighborhood that was still at that point really working class. And I just really loved it. And then I got to this neighborhood that had been largely rebuilt after the war. I found out that it had been completely firebombed down to the ground. And but then slowly getting to know it, my apartment looked out on a river that was covered by an elevated highway in the way that they do things in Tokyo to save space. And it was just an amazing place, because the more you looked at it, the more life there was there, the more interest. And then and also it was the hottest summer on record so far in Tokyo. So like between that and the humidity and the sensuality, and my skin was always kind of damp, it led me into this kind of end of the world love story.
Shelly, I was just grinning because for those of you who are not aware of like the humidity like of summers like in Japan, just it's one of those things where like you go out and then you're immediately drenched in sweat, and the density like of I mean, you can't really fight it. Like you just have to succumb like to the weight of the humidity like of summer. Like, but just thought I'd add that. Yes.
Yeah, it's like walking into a solid object when I used to open my apartment door and there it was. But then as Stefanie said, yes, it was waiting and watching. And the film was primarily shot on a tripod. And, you know, spending so much time every morning, I had my ritual of seeing who or what was floating by in the river. And then I would go to McDonald's because they were the first place open for coffee, and I would write. And then I would go out into the neighborhood as much as I could stand it with my heavy camera and tripod and full sun. Yeah, yeah. And the story, when I wrote it, it was very, very fragile. And to try to capture that fragility and yet still maintain, to keep people in this neighborhood and under this kind of tone of the film and this relationship as they discover each other.
How was it for you to write a text that is actually about you? I mean, it's not you, but in a way it is you as a someone who traveled somewhere else for research or to make a film. So, but then you wrote a text that creates a perspective on the artist. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, someone could, or maybe they will, or whatever, ask a question like, why didn't you write it from the point of view of the American? And, you know, I have a lot to say about that, but I guess briefly, I would just say I had no desire to, right? That this would not be a discovery for me, but I also was afraid that if I wrote from the point of view of the American, I would be stereotypical, you know, that somehow I didn't trust myself to, you know, who knows, maybe I could have, but I just had no interest. Whereas the point of view of the translator, it was a bit of a discovery. And I also liked, and I think that, you know, one can see this also in Touch, the sort of formality of the character, but also the playfulness or at times aggressivity of the character, that both of them somehow have to be in the place of translating, somehow, you know, belong, but maybe not fully. You know, there's the scene where the American, at that point, girlfriend just sort of kisses her on the street, and like the processing power of the Japanese woman saying, you know, don't want her to be doing this, shouldn't be doing this, you know, but then, you know, this sort of liberatory, but then pushing away feeling that, I don't know, I somehow find so true to myself also. Yeah, that's what I would say, that a lot of my films, my early films were very aggressive and pushed desire away. They were almost unwatchable because the idea was really to get back at the stupid viewer who watched television and believed in things that they shouldn't believe in, and then nobody watched it. And then with Meet the People, I finally realized, well, Shelley, you love television and you love movies and you love fiction and making things up. And maybe if you stuck with desire as a pathway to the viewer, but also to yourself, that this would be a better thing. That's not saying that the desire is always good or without rules or gnarly or aggressive, you know, because often that desire is in my films. You know, it's very heavily questioned.
And in terms of feminism that you that she also mentions as before the artist arrives, she knows that this will be a topic. So it's kind of like, okay, here comes the Western feminism. I would like to come back to what Soyoung said earlier. I brought in that we're now discussing this in a time where they're very frustrating in a very frustrating situation in the US, where you have to discuss, or where you have to start from scratch again. So could you speak a little bit maybe about that, like how your concept of feminism in Japan or in general when you were traveling was challenged?
I think that my idea around feminism is always challenged. I mean, on the one hand, as it should be, because things change, language changes. I have this photograph, I'm very embarrassed to say, from the 80s, where I'm in the front line of an anti-Playboy demonstration. And I was thinking, like, Shelley, what was on your mind there, of all things to protest, and so I mean, I think that it's always in flux. On the other hand, it's something that I think about and suffer from. And in a way, one of the reasons why I would have loved to have moved to Japan, but Japan is very difficult for women. And the longer you're there, the longer you're aware of how difficult it is. That I was there, I was on sort of a STEAM grant, I was treated in a certain way. So I was an American first and on this grant first, and then I was a woman. But eventually it can be very difficult. I mean, Germany is an interesting question, because I just did a film that I would like to think of as very feminist, Girls Museum, asking a group of girls to talk about artworks in Historical Art Museum in Leipzig. And like all museums, the work is overwhelmingly done by men. And the way that women and girls are imaged in the museum is really, can be very, very difficult if you're trying to be an empowered person. So this is something that really threads through my work often. Yeah, not in former East, former West. Certainly, this was another topic.
I'd like to return to this, but I was just thinking about one thing that you said, Shelley, earlier, about how when you screen a tiny place that is hard to touch, one of the questions that you get is why not the perspective of the American? And on one level, like, what made me immediately think about this was that wanted to ask Stefanie, like, do you consider, like, Shelley an American filmmaker? Like, that was one question that popped into my mind, and I still might want to ask that. But then I was also thinking, and to hear your answer, Stefanie, that if I were to speak from the perspective of the American, that I'd be stereotypical, and how hard it is to speak of oneself. And that made me think of this other film that will be part of the series, called Suicide, where you very, in a sense, aggressively take on the perspective of the person who speaks from the position of oneself, or only of oneself. But perhaps, but before we go to something like Suicide, may I ask, return to this question about, this is my own curiosity about being an American filmmaker. Like, Stefanie, do you consider Shelley an American filmmaker, or is there a particularly American film of her own? Yes.
That's a very interesting question, because I think we discussed this over and over over the years. Okay. And really, because it's, I mean, first of all, I should say that Shelley, the first time that she came as a filmmaker to Berlin was shortly after the war came down, and the first time I came to New York, actually was the second time, but the first time was long before. So the first real time I came to New York was shortly after 9/11. And then also immediately I had Shelley's perspective, kind of from her apartment onto the World Trade Center, or not anymore then, of course. And so we both, I think, experienced the places of the other in a very historic context. That's how our I think friendship and work relationship began. And then I think we discussed our perspectives a lot, and they both came with certain stereotypes or prejudice. And But in that sense, because of the intensity of, and also the not just the intensity, also the fact that we moved on through our work and friendship for so many years, I think for me it's like now a clear no. I would not consider her as an American filmmaker in that sense. If you say that, if you mean it as a something typical. So I mean, I would probably, if I would do that, I would anyway only, not in relation to Shelley, but other people, then I would anyway do it in a strategic way, because I mean, what is an American filmmaker? What is a German filmmaker? What is so this is in any way, I think, not the right way to describe someone. But of course, I understand your question, and then I would have to say no.
I mean, talking about these definitions of what is an American filmmaker, what is a German filmmaker, and really questioning those definitions. I also think that one of the things that I've seen in your collaboration, you're working with Shelly and Stefanie, is this question of what is the film. And if I could just slightly allow this tangent, I'm very curious about the objects behind you, Stefanie. Like, if you could speak a little bit about not just like these questions that constantly make define what it means to be American, to be Japanese, to be German, and this constant the questions about belonging. There's also behind you a work by Shelly that is about what is or is not a film. So if you could speak a little bit about that, Stefanie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good thing about very long-lasting work relationships is that you really trust each other, and you know each other's way of seeing things and thinking in a very intimate way. And so I felt like that Shelley would be the perfect person to ask to make a film, or actually 2 films, as you can see, like film, in order to decay afterwards. So we have a film archive at the Arsenal. We are not just like cinema, we also have a very large analog film archive, and we are faced with the problem of the vinegar syndrome, which is most people probably know it, but it's a chemical process that has to do with aging of film material, and it's a huge big problem for archives, because also it's how do you say, like you really have to isolate films. It's contagious if they get the vinegar syndrome, and you cannot, the film dies if you don't digitize it immediately. It might be lost very soon. So we asked, and people often don't know about archive problems, and in order, we always trying to be very transparent about our work and our institution, and so we wanted to put a film into a terrarium, as you can see it here. And this terrarium is in a restaurant at Silent Green, where our film archive is located. And so this inside the terrarium, it's way too warm and way too, the humidity is very high. So the films are made to die. And people can watch it over the years, and every once in a while we take them out and project them to show people what has already happened to the materiality of the film. And so we asked Shelley if she was willing to make a film to die, and that of course is a big challenge. I mean, how to produce something and then it won't survive. But then maybe Shelley should say a little bit about what she then did and why you chose this very concept for this particular project.
Yeah, one of the films is called Turn, and it's based on the last shot in Breathless, where you have Gene Seberg turning away, from the camera after Belmondo says that you're disgusting. And then she turns away, you get the back of her head. And I wanted to take a group of women and reverse the turn so that you see the back of their head, and then they turn and they look into the camera. And there were some strangers, but largely it's a lot of women that I know and love, and and also quite a few, mostly women who are in film, in the moving image. And then the color film is a more, I don't want to say Stan Brakhage film, but sort of glimpses of the neighborhood that I was living in at the moment and further on. And it has this kind of time capsule feeling to it. I was shooting with a Bolex, one of the crank Bolexes, and even the footage looks kind of, the places look old-fashioned, the people look old-fashioned, even though it's all contemporary. So it's a little bit of a kind of love letter to Berlin with this. There's some language in it that plays on future, no future, which of course is connected to the possible futures or the future of the film that will decompose its color, so it'll decompose in a different way than the black and white, which will get the vinegar syndrome. But I've heard that the color is actually decomposing faster than the black and white at the moment. I wanted to speak a little bit about this frame, American filmmaker. This is something that really interests me. Also,
and I should have said something before you do that. I should have said something very important, and because you made this also films about Chinatown where you live. So I think in that sense, of course, you are very much located where you are and where you grew up and where you have been living for so many years now in Chinatown. And I think you're very aware of this, and you make this a topic of your films. And in that sense, you are an American filmmaker because you're aware of where you are and what your position is and what your perspective is, and you make this transparent, and you see this as a field of negotiation and change and move. So in that sense, you are, I maybe didn't give the right answer because you're American, because you are where you are and you know that. But in other ways, I think when we speak about certain cliches, so I would say no. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, frame, and it's also really interesting when you think about framing and fiction, which maybe we'll get into, but I would say, so what are the things that touch me, but also what are the frames that I consciously or unconsciously have in my brain that I try to move around as much as possible. And I would say certainly, American passport, immigration has touched my family, like almost all families in the United States quite a bit. But I would also say, and this surprises me because I come from parents who are atheists, a certain way of thinking in terms of being Jewish where you question everything. Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi so-and-so says that. And it's always a discussion. There's no right or wrong answer, finally. And also we were very linguistically driven family, if you want to think about like big, loud arguments at the table, and also a way of taking power over each other who could out-argue. So I think that I've been really formed by that. And I think that I've also been formed by fiction. I mean, growing up, books saved my life, and the ability to become someone else for, I would read a book a night. For that evening, I was, some king in, the 16th century or, whatever, that really has changed the way that I think that I make stories about myself and probably make stories about other people that I want to have exist in the world. That's a short list.
No, I have many thoughts because I was thinking that just on this last moment, it's thinking about we started this particular train of conversation talking about the American domestic politics, and thinking that just in this recent but also there's this recent round around the debates, like the struggle around abortion, like the way that so much of the debate is driven around this question of at least from the side of the conservatives who want to prohibit like abortion, like that it's about tradition, like, and it requires a very, very like textual, like a very literal reading like of the Constitution of the United States as if it's a founding text. And what it prohibits like is the very act of not only translation but interpretation. So Shelly, I'm very moved by the fact that your being American is also by being fiction, like by immersing myself in fiction and in the possibility of being other, in the possibility precisely of translation, of imagining otherwise. And so there are different Americas, like one America that is sticking to the text, like as if language can be held in stasis, like that one word can only mean one thing. Like, I mean, this is the context of Alito's leaked draft, like, but and there's this other America, like, and for those of you who are watching this in relationship to the curated series, I would also recommend that you watch 5 Lessons and 9 Questions About Chinatown to see the particular part of America that Shelly calls home. Like, so this a different kind of America in the sense that is committed to the storytelling, the stories it tells itself, like the fictional aspect that we are always newcomers like to this country that is not ours. Like, and so I just thought I might add that. And I was thinking about that in relationship to the film we were just talking about, a tiny place that is hard to touch, and the role of fiction there. What do it means for you to speak from the position of the Japanese woman? And I just wanted to kind of wrap it up to just say that I didn't think that vinegar syndrome might be a really great link like between all this, but suddenly as Stefanie was talking about the humidity and the decomposition of the film, and then thinking about the fact that we can think about a tiny place that is hard to touch itself as the story of a place, but it's also of 2 women that are where their own attempt to account for the place they are start suffering from vinegar syndrome, where it kind of falls apart, decomposes, melts down under the humidity, but isn't necessarily destroyed as if there's no story to tell, as if it's only one story to tell, but then it keeps on mutating like into alien devices, like such as that of science fiction. Like, so just thought that was a happy coincidence of multiple things.
And the translator, of course, is in the driving seat of that. And, you know, the stories do get, on the one hand, bleaker and bleaker, but then I don't want to give away the ending, but I do think that the final story is her way of trying to recoup. I remember when I showed it at Forum Expanded, and the first question was about how incredibly depressing the film was. And I was like, no, it's not depressing at all. I find it really hopeful. And, you know, maybe that's my own insanity, but I do think that somewhere between the relationship of the women, but also the imagination of the translator, that there is some sort of way forward in the social imaginary, which then, of course, could turn into a reality, right? Because that's, you know, that's what we have to cling to at the moment, the social imaginary of, you know, not necessarily of people who are, you know, trying to put us back in, I wouldn't even say the 20th century.
19th century, like very, very explicitly the 19th century.
But we too have our own, you know, kind of present, but also imaginary of the future that they're clearly quite scared of.
Exactly. So I know we are running out of time, but I thought we could talk, maybe see one last clip from the film Suicide, the train swim failure clip, and then make that our last note of the discussion. So
yeah,
David?
That would be great. I think that we have some leeway, so that'd be fab.
I have failed miserably. The game is played, and I've lost. You have. Absolutely, definitively, miserably. The game is lost, with this one exception. That you can take the dice in your hand and throw them again.
This was a little bit of a gift to myself. I had forgotten about this scene. Maybe I should set it up a little bit because it's sort of coming out of nowhere, which I also love. Suicide is a film that's about, I had this idea because people were starting to film aggressively in public space. I think it was John Jost, one video artist who started doing that. And I wanted to examine what that meant. And of course, this was a very different time where people didn't have such anger, fear, rushing over with the police towards using a camera. And I wanted to see how far I could push the boundaries of it. So I made a character who was suicidal because I thought, yes, she'll get a lot of sympathy. Like she's not just doing it to be aggressive, she's doing it to save herself, who travels around the world. It's mostly filmed in public space, using the camera as a way to re-find or find her desire to go on living again. And I picked this scene because I just love the opening shot of the girl who came up to me on a Swiss train, this child, and I turned the pull-out viewfinder around. So she was with me, but she was with herself. And this kind of live moment, and it's really children, finally, that the trauma that the suicidal woman suffers from is a kind of trauma from childhood, but it's the children in the film that really come to, if she's saved, to save her. Anyway, that's my start off. But I mean, this film, I mean, all the films, but I think this film, for myself really shows what an incredibly, I mean, I'm such a lens-based artist, and what the camera does in terms of making connections and like it's just, I mean, I'm not saying it's the best shot ever or the best film ever. I'm just saying that that's one of the things that I've never lost the love for all these years of making films. That's like a little, yeah. This wouldn't happen now. I think that the mother would have gotten the little girl and pulled her over and, like, what are you doing? Yeah.
Shelly, I'm not sure what I can add. I think that's such a wonderful way to actually end our discussion, but not to say we should, but it's just, yes, it's.
Well, I have one other thing that I want to say, which is tied to this, which is tied to a lot of my films, not 37 Stories About Leaving Home, but I think maybe all the other films that we saw today were filmed in public space. And this, I think that part of what you were talking about, Soyoung, is this kind of divisive moment, but also this complete displaced lack of trust for each other. And I would say displaced because really it should be placed on corporations, income inequality, or institutions, governments, whatever, but that it gets played out among ourselves. And this makes it really hard to go forward. And I mean, I would say hard to go forward as a filmmaker, but that's really beside the point in the scope of, these larger issues that we're dealing with, that it's really tragic, I find. And so that's something that I want to continue chipping away at with my camera.
I think you really show like the way that from actually, I think there's been a consistent tendency, like in your films, of what the camera can do, like that. Like if you, as Stefanie said before, if you just watch and wait, like not in a passive position, but in a way that what it means to keep on see what we are trained to unsee, like that is definitely like a I mean, the other thing I wanted to say was I keep on being very moved by the image behind Stefanie, like of your work. Like now that I know more about the context, I realize that it's not an image that it's held in stasis, that it's constantly, yes, decomposing, but you're also allowing for the passage of time. Like, and we can talk about it in terms of like mortality or death, but it also with the passage of time, things can change. Like, and I think one of the things that are very difficult, like thinking about these divisions that keep on coming up in your film, be it in public space or that of the space of our dreams or our fantasies, is how things keep on repeating over and over and over, how difficult change is and what it means to if not like not just even celebrate, but try to find like a change in its most small, detailed level, even in like the slow decomposition, like of time, like of film, like the way that like humidity also means intimacy, like the touch of air, a touch of skin, like how that can be a beginning. Like, so just talking in relationship to it's quite wonderful to see the clips in this order and see that look of that child like staring so intently back at you. Yes, at us.
Right. Yeah, actually, I just noticed that I'm starting to melt in this image because of the light. The light is changing. It's like it's late. It's like getting dark in Germany. But no, but of course, this is also a very good example, as you say, like of watching and waiting. We are waiting for the films to decay. But of course, I mean, I hope that was clear that watching and waiting does not mean no action. I think it just, like giving it time. Watching and waiting just means give things time, find your place in where you are, in the context where you are. And then I think action becomes clearer and much easier because you first have a process of learning and unlearning, and then of course action can follow or understanding can follow. So, but I guess that was clear, and I think it's that's definitely clear when you watch Shelly's films that they do a lot more than watching and waiting.
And I agree that, that this kind of cyclical, but I also think that there, I mean, maybe this is something to do with my age. I'm older than both of you, and I was close enough to the 60s that I was really touched by the 60s. Also, I was touched by people's real disappointment in the 60s, which I saw also in former East and West in Berlin, especially among the left in the West, feeling like this option was disappearing and why weren't they fighting for another like option rather than capitalism. But then moving forward, having lived through Occupy and Black Lives Matter, you see also that there is this passing of the baton, right? That it's not like Occupy failed. Occupy is there and it goes forward in these other ways. And that doesn't mean that I have a sunny view of our future necessarily, but I do think that it's not just repetition. Yeah, it's not just repetition. And even if you look at, the history of the moving image, or feminism, that there have been huge changes compared to my mother's time, and also therefore huge backlash.
Maybe that is a good place for us to end. All right, so thank you very much, for all of you who are joining this conversation, and thank you very much to Stefanie and Shelly. This was a wonderful hour, and I've learned so much, and I hope we can continue this conversation. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank everybody.
Thank you so much. Okay.